Welcome back to World Spotlight TV. Today we will talk about Rolex, one of the most valuable luxury brands in the world, and its origin. Before continuing, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. One of the most expensive brands in the world, Rolex is currently valued at almost $8 billion. Its origins can be traced back to a young orphan, who after having his inheritance stolen, used his willpower to overcome his obstacles and rebuild his life. After leaving his hometown and relocating to another nation, he decided to follow his passion and start a watchmaking business. Little did he know, however, that this business endeavor would take him to the forefront of modern wristwatches, revolutionizing the industry and building a billion-dollar empire. Hans Eberhard Wilhelm Wilsdorf, or better known as Hans Wilsdorf, was born in Kulmbach, Germany, on parents Anna and Johann Daniel Wilsdorf on March 22, 1881. He was one of 3 kids, the second son. His family passed down a largely profitable firm that they had run. His grandfather, who sold iron goods and put them in the middle class. Regrettably, his mother was unwell during the following few years and passed away in 1892. His father passed away as well, leaving Hans an orphan. The moment his mother's brothers took custody of him, his uncle sold the family business and used some of the proceeds to pay for the 3 of them to attend a wonderful, prestigious boarding school in Germany's Bavaria called Ernestinum Coburg. Early on, Hans despised this choice and fell into depression. Hans was an outsider in the new town and frequently made fun of by other lads for his beliefs. He made the decision to concentrate on academics in order to get through his challenging upbringing. Hans loved reading and developed into a pretty intelligent student. He particularly excelled in arithmetic and languages, where he studied both French and English. He secured a position as an apprentice for an international pearl exporting company at the age of 19. This business purchased pearls from various marketplaces and graded, packaged, and sold them to jewelers. He immersed himself there to study their business strategies. One day, a letter from a friend offering Hans a position at the Kuno Korten Company arrived in the mail. At the time, Kuno Korten was one of the largest high-quality watchmaking companies and exported pocket watches worth around £1 million Swiss francs annually. He was employed by this corporation in 1900 as a clerk and English correspondent. Thanks to the English writing and reading skills he acquired in school, he was earning an 80 Swiss franc monthly paycheck. He was also in charge of checking the accuracy of hundreds of pocket watches each day while winding hundreds more. After only 2 years in Kuno Korten, he was required to return to Germany and serve in the military. He relocated to London, England, to work for another high-end watch company after completing his duty at the age of 22. There, he was now in charge of expanding their sales and had a higher responsibility. He was passionate about starting his own watch company and was gaining as much expertise as he could for it. He also met Florence Frances May Crotty, whom he would marry shortly after during those years. One day, Hans and his brother-in-law Alfred James Davis were discussing their lives and future plans. Hans said that with the right amount of funding, he would be able to start his own watch company. Alfred was able to afford it and was aware of Hans' ardent interest in watches. Despite his youth, he took a chance on the German and shook hands with him after telling him he would support his business initiative and be willing to contribute his money. They also established the Wilsdorf and Davis Limited in 1905, which was to become Rolex a few years later. They partnered up with a Swiss watch company called Hermann Egler, which was based in Switzerland. They also opened an office in Bienne, Switzerland to favor his partnership there. Soon after, they were specializing in the distribution of timepieces at affordable rates. Even though Hans was a lover of watches, there was one major thing he found unfavorable about the watch industry: pocket watches. At the time, wristwatches were mostly worn by women as jewelry, and were looked down upon by some. Until then, it was thought to be almost impossible to create the perfect wristwatch that could consistently show the exact time and be in everyday use. Hans foresaw that wristwatches would eventually become the new standard for everyone, and was completely focused on coming up with the ideal wristwatch for it. He spent the next several years traveling to many countries all around Europe, and met countless watchmakers to discuss about the small details of watches. During those years, he started to release his own wrist watches. Beginning the same year, he founded his company one watch after another. He was crafting down on creating a better high-quality and reliable wristwatch for men and women, applying what he learned from other watchmakers from his journey. Soon after, his company began to get some traction. And by 1908, it was one of the top firms in the watchmaking industry in England. By this time, Hans was ready to rename his business to something more upscale, memorable, and no matter the language, it's simple to say. It also needed to be short, so the name could fit easily in the dial of the watch. He spent a big deal of time combining 5 letters from the alphabet to come up with something, until finally Rolex was born. And a few days later, he registered the Rolex name as a trademark for Wilsdorf and Davis Limited. In 1908, during the next few years, Rolex was becoming known for its high-quality wristwatches, and many rich people were already starting to use it. The First World War broke out, and many businesses, including watch companies, struggled to survive. In some cases, businesses had to close down, but not Rolex. Many soldiers were given Rolex watches instead of pocket watches, because it was much easier and safer to use. It also helped them to better coordinate their attacks because of its precision on time. By then, the company had grown to such extent that they were employing 60 people in 1914, and had big open office spaces in London. Hans later registered Rolex's famous trademark logo of the 5-star crown 10 years later, which became implemented on the dial of their watches. In 1926, Rolex released their new model, the Rolex Oyster, the first ever waterproof wrist watch in history. In 1927, Hans heard about a woman from London named Mercedes Glixa, who claimed to be capable of swimming across the English Channel, a 20.5-mile body of water that separated England and France. People didn't believe her, so she was set to do it again in front of thousands of people, even though the water temperature was much colder. Hans saw the opportunity and encouraged her to wear a Rolex Oyster watch around her neck. After swimming for over 10 hours, she was pulled out from the water. The task was not a complete success, but the Rolex Oyster came out of the water in perfect condition. This is the point where Rolex rose to international fame as a revolutionary watch. Hans also marketed his Rolex Oyster inside of fishbowls with real fishes in it, on the sale display of every Rolex dealership for people to see. In 1928, he worked with the top British model Evelyn Leigh to promote his watches, and of course there were pictures of her wearing her wristwatch inside a fishbowl. "Only great marketing is needed to make a company successful," said Wilsdorf. During these times, Rolex continued to fascinate people when they introduced their updated model, the Rolex Oyster Perpetual, in 1931. This was the first ever waterproof and self-winding wristwatch. When World War II broke out, Rolex took a hard hit. It became difficult and expensive to export products outside of Switzerland to some other big markets in Europe. Hans was frustrated with the situation. Another tragedy followed when his wife passed away in 1944. To commemorate his wife, he established the Wilsdorf Foundation, a charity organization for social causes. Shortly before Hans' death, he transferred 100% ownership of Rolex to the Wilsdorf Foundation, which still owns and controls Rolex to this day. As soon as World War II finished, Rolex started to take off, and tremendously. In 1945, Rolex Datejust model was released. It is the first waterproof self-winding wristwatch to indicate the date of the month on the dial. This was followed by another revolutionary model nearly 10 years later, the Rolex Day Date, the first waterproof and self-winding wristwatch to not only include the date of the month but also the day of the week. These types of watches are still seen to this day, which is often the standard for normal use of wrist watches. The Rolex Submariner was introduced in 1953. It was the first deep-diving waterproof wrist watch that could reach 100 meters deep in the ocean without getting dysfunctional. Hans Wilsdorf died in the year 1960. Following his death, Rolex started to approach itself as the luxury brand it is today. The company focused their marketing more toward being an exclusive watch collection for people of high society. In 1985, Rolex started to manufacture their watches with 904L, a very endurable and expensive steel, becoming the first watch to ever do so, which is one of the reasons for their expensive prices. Rolex is the most recognizable watch brand in the world today, thanks to an orphan boy who started with nothing. His passion for design and technological innovation has elevated him to the ranks of the industry's most powerful men. Rolex is being worn and his legacy can be seen in everyone today. I sincerely hope you enjoy this video. If you have any requests or recommendations, just leave a comment below. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to this channel.